It was just another evening drive home for Emily. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. The road was quiet, lined with towering trees that cast long shadows across the pavement. Emily hummed softly to the radio, her thoughts drifting between her long day at work and what she'd make for dinner. But just as she rounded a bend, her foot slammed on the brake, her heart leaping into her throat. Right there in the middle of the road stood a deer. Not just any deer, a young buck with wide, frightened eyes staring directly at her. Emily's hands tightened on the wheel, her breath catching as she tried to process the unexpected sight. The deer didn't move, he didn't flinch. He just stood there, his body tense, his legs slightly shaking. Something about him felt off. He wasn't frozen in fear like most deer caught in headlights. He was standing with purpose, like he was waiting for something. Or someone. Emily's pulse raced. She tapped her horn lightly, expecting him to dart back into the trees, but he didn't. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step toward her car. Then another. Emily's instincts told her to stay put, to wait, to watch. That's when she noticed something strange. His eyes weren't just filled with fear. They were pleading, begging, as if he needed her to understand something. A shiver ran down her spine. What was he trying to tell her? Was he hurt? Was he in trouble? Emily leaned forward, gripping the steering wheel as a million thoughts rushed through her mind. Then, before she could make a decision, the deer suddenly turned. Not to run away, but to lead. Emily hesitated for only a second before her curiosity took over. With one last glance around the empty road, she shifted her car into park and reached for the door handle. She had no idea what she was about to walk into, but something in her gut told her. This wasn't just a lost deer. He needed her, and she was about to find out why. Emily hesitated for a moment before pushing the car door open. The cool night air brushed against her skin as she stepped out onto the empty road, her heart pounding in her chest. The deer had stopped a few feet away, his ears twitching as he glanced back at her. It was as if he was waiting, making sure she was following. She took a cautious step forward, unsure of what she was getting herself into. "Hey there," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The deer didn't bolt. Instead, he flicked his tail and turned toward the trees, disappearing into the shadows. For a split second, Emily considered getting back in her car and driving away. This was crazy. What was she doing, following a wild animal into the dark woods? But something about the way he had looked at her, the urgency in his eyes, made it impossible to ignore. She pulled out her phone, turning on the flashlight, and took a deep breath before stepping off the road. The ground was uneven beneath her feet, the crunch of leaves and twigs the only sound besides the distant chirping of crickets. The deer wasn't far ahead, his light brown coat blending into the trees. He moved slowly, glancing back every few steps as if making sure she was still there. Emily's mind raced with possibilities. Was he leading her to something, or was this all in her head? Maybe she had misread the whole situation. Maybe he was just as lost as she was. But deep down, she didn't believe that. Then, after several minutes of following him deeper into the woods, she heard it. A sound that sent a chill down her spine, a faint, muffled cry. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her flashlight beam trembled slightly as she swept it across the trees, searching for the source. The deer had stopped just ahead, his body still, his ears pointed toward the sound. Someone was out here, and they needed help. Emily's pulse quickened as she took another step forward, her eyes darting around the dense forest. Who was out here? How had they ended up in trouble? She swallowed hard, gripping her phone tighter. Whatever was waiting for her just beyond the trees, she knew one thing for sure. This night was about to take a turn she never could have imagined. Emily's heart pounded as she stepped closer to the sound. The faint cry was coming from somewhere just beyond the trees, hidden in the darkness. She shone her flashlight ahead, but the thick branches made it hard to see. The deer stood still, his body tense, his ears twitching as though he too was listening. Then the cry came again. This time it was clearer, a child's voice, weak, frightened. Emily's breath caught in her throat. A child? Out here, alone? She quickened her pace, pushing past branches and uneven ground, ignoring the sharp sting of twigs scratching against her arms. Her flashlight flickered as she swept it across the forest floor, searching for any sign of movement. The deer trotted ahead, leading her toward the sound, and then she saw it. A small figure curled up. Ai zrenie, увитый вокруг ствола дерева. A little boy, no older than 5 or 6, his clothes dirty, his face streaked with tears. His arms clutched tightly around his knees as he shivered. Emily's chest tightened. "Oh my God," she whispered, rushing forward. "Hey, sweetheart, it's okay. I'm here to help." The boy lifted his head slowly, his big, terrified eyes locking onto hers. He didn't speak, but his lips trembled as if he wanted to. Emily knelt beside him, her mind racing with questions. How had he ended up here? Where were his parents? She reached out gently. "Are you hurt?" The boy hesitated, then shook his head. But before Emily could ask anything else, the deer let out a sharp snort, its body suddenly rigid. It wasn't looking at the boy, it was staring into the trees behind them. Emily followed its gaze. Something else was out there, watching. Emily's breath hitched as she turned her flashlight toward the trees. The beam wavered against the dense shadows, but she saw nothing, just the endless stretch of branches swaying in the night breeze. And yet, the deer remained frozen, its muscles tensed, its ears locked in one direction. It wasn't just staring, it was warning her. A chill ran down Emily's spine. The little boy clung to her sleeve now, his small fingers trembling against her skin. He hadn't said a word, but his wide eyes told her everything. He was just as scared as she was. Then the sound came, a rustling, slow, deliberate. Something or someone was moving just beyond her line of sight. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears as she scanned the trees, her fingers tightening around her phone. Every instinct told her they weren't alone. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "Is there someone out there?" she called, her voice more unsteady than she wanted it to be. Silence. The deer took a cautious step back, then another. Emily could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal. The deer would have bolted by now. The boy tugged on her sleeve again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please," he said, "we have to go." Emily's stomach twisted. He knew something she didn't. Another rustle. Closer this time, a snap of a branch. Emily grabbed the boy's hand, her heart racing. She needed to get them out of here, but just as she turned to move, something shifted in the darkness. A shadow, a figure, and then the sound of footsteps, coming straight for them. Emily's grip tightened around the little boy's hand as the footsteps grew louder. Her pulse thundered in her ears, her flashlight shaking slightly as she pointed it toward the sound. But before she could see anything, the deer suddenly bolted. It leaped into the shadows, disappearing in an instant, as if sensing something even more dangerous than she had. Emily barely had time to process it before a figure emerged from the darkness. A man. His face was hidden in the dim light, but his posture was rigid, his movements slow and deliberate. Emily's stomach twisted. Something about him felt wrong. He didn't call out, didn't ask for help. He just stood there, watching. The little boy's hand gripped hers tighter. "That's him," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily's blood ran cold. "Who?" she asked, her voice just as quiet. The boy shook his head frantically, his entire body trembling. "The man who took me." Emily's breath hitched. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The man took another step forward, his boots crunching against the leaves. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice eerily calm. Emily forced herself to stand her ground. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "What are you doing out here?" The man ignored her question. His gaze flickered to the boy, and something in his expression shifted. It wasn't anger, it was something worse, possessive. Emily felt the boy press himself closer to her side. "We need to go," he whimpered. The man took another step. "He doesn't belong with you," he said, his tone unnervingly smooth. "Give him back." Panic surged through Emily's veins. There was no way she was letting go of this child. Whatever had happened, whoever this man was, she knew one thing for sure. This boy wasn't safe with him. She took a shaky step backward, pulling the child with her. "Stay away from us." The man's lips curled into a slow, unsettling smile. "You don't understand," he murmured. "You're making a mistake." Then, before she could react, he lunged. Emily barely had time to react before the man lunged. Her instincts kicked in, and she yanked the boy back, stumbling as she tried to put distance between them. Her flashlight slipped from her hand, landing with a dull thud on the forest floor, its beam now casting eerie shadows across the trees. The man reached for the boy, his movements fast, desperate. But before his fingers could touch him, something crashed through the darkness. The deer. It charged forward, its powerful legs kicking up dirt and leaves as it barreled straight into the man. A guttural shout tore from his throat as he was knocked off balance, his body slamming hard against the ground. Emily didn't wait. She grabbed the boy's hand and ran. Branches scraped against her arms, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she pushed forward, feet pounding against the uneven ground. The boy clung to her side, struggling to keep up, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Behind them, the man groaned, trying to recover. The deer let out a sharp snort, standing protectively between them and him, its stance unwavering. Emily didn't dare look back. She could hear the rustling, the shifting of leaves. He was getting up. Her car. She had to get to her car. The trees finally thinned, and the glow of headlights filled her vision. Relief flooded through her as she sprinted toward it, yanking the door open and practically lifting the boy into the passenger seat. Just as she slammed the door shut, she saw him. The man had emerged from the trees, his face twisted with something between rage and frustration. He took a step forward, then stopped. The deer was still there, standing between them. Emily's hand shook as she locked the doors and started the engine. The boy curled into the seat, silent, his wide eyes locked on the man outside. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the man's expression shifted again. His anger faded. In its place, something else flickered. Recognition. But not toward Emily, not even toward the boy. He was staring at the deer. Emily didn't wait to understand. She slammed her foot on the gas, tires kicking up gravel as she sped away. As the car roared down the road, she dared one last glance in the rearview mirror. The man was gone. But the deer was still standing there, watching. Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart was still hammering, her breath coming in shaky gasps. The boy sat beside her, silent, his small body curled up as though he was afraid to move. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark, but Emily kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man chasing after them. But he was gone. Only the deer remained, standing motionless in the distance, its eyes following them until the trees swallowed it from view. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The car's headlights cut through the night, the only sound the steady hum of the engine. Emily stole a glance at the boy. He was staring down at his hands, his fingers gripping the fabric of his dirty shirt. "You're safe now," she said softly, her voice steadier than she felt. The boy finally looked up at her. "You believe me now?" he whispered. Emily swallowed. She didn't know what she believed. None of it made sense. The way the deer had led her straight to him, the way it had stood between them and that man, almost as if it knew what was happening, and the way the man had looked at it, like he recognized it. "Who was he?" she asked. The boy hesitated. "A bad man," he said finally. "He took me from my mum." His voice wavered. "I ran away when he wasn't looking, but I got lost." Emily's stomach twisted. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. As the dispatcher answered, relief washed over her. Help was on the way. This nightmare would soon be over. The boy let out a shaky breath. "The deer saved me," he murmured. Emily didn't know what to say. She had no explanation for what had happened, but deep down, she knew the boy was right. Later, as flashing police lights filled the road and the boy was reunited with his mother, Emily stood to the side, watching. The officers asked her questions, but her mind kept drifting back to the forest, to the deer that had disappeared into the night. Maybe she'd never understand what had really happened, but one thing was certain. She hadn't just stumbled upon that boy by accident. Something had led her there. And somewhere in the darkness, the deer was still watching.